I want you to start by picturing something in your mind right now. Like, picture one of the most famous, globally recognized images in modern history.
Oh, I bet people already know the one before you even finish describing it.
Right. It is that highly stylized, high contrast black and red poster. The intense, unyielding stare, the unruly hair, the beret tilted, just perfectly.
Yeah, it's an image that's been printed and, reprinted, mass-produced on millions of T-shirts, dorm room posters, protest banners, just all over the world.
Exactly. And when you see it, you immediately think of absolute defiance. You think of this hardened, mythical, almost invincible figure.
It's transcended photography at this point.
Mm,
It operates way more like a global logo
yeah.
because whether someone loves what it stands for or, absolutely despises it, the visual shorthand is completely universal. Is this icon of rebellion that feels entirely larger than life, like he's almost detached from human frailty.
Right, but I want you to take that poster in your mind and completely tear it down. Just rip it
Sure.
to shreds.
Okay, setting the stage.
Because to understand the actual foundation of the source material we are looking at today, we need you to imagine something entirely different, something entirely human.
Much more vulnerable.
Yes. Imagine a fragile, pale little boy in 1930s Argentina. It is the middle of the night. He is sitting bolt upright in bed, completely awake. His eyes are just wide with panic.
Hi.
And he is gasping, like desperately, terrifyingly gasping for a single breath of air.
Yeah, his parents are frantic, rushing him out of his bed and into the cool night breeze.
Exactly. Just praying that his chest will stop heaving long enough for oxygen to reach his brain.
It's a profound disconnect, isn't it? The invincible symbol on the T-shirt versus a suffocating child sitting in the dark, entirely at the mercy of his own biology.
And that disconnect is exactly what we are exploring today. Today, we are operating purely as, I guess you could say, psychological architects.
I like that framing.
We're taking the source material we've gathered and stripping away the myth, the pop culture iconography, the endless commercialization. And just to be completely clear with you up front, because we are dealing with a historical figure whose actions and ideologies are incredibly polarizing.
Oh, extremely polarizing. They evoke intense, conflicting emotions globally.
Exactly. So we are leaving the politics at the door. No picking sides.
Right. No defending or condemning a historical record.
None of that. We are here to objectively look at the raw data of his early life. We want to understand the hidden psychological blueprint of Ernesto Guevara.
And specifically, we're looking at how the terrifying reality of chronic, severe childhood asthma colliding with a fiercely unconventional family environment forged his character.
Right, the exact character traits that would later define a revolutionary.
Yeah, we're looking at the mechanics of personality here. Like, how does a failing body create a specific kind of mind?
It's a fascinating question.
We'll trace that evolution from the suffocating nights of his youth into the intellectual pressure cooker of his bohemian family home and ultimately see how that unique tension pushed him out of his library.
And onto the open roads of a highly unequal continent.
Exactly.
Let's start right there with that physical reality. We are in Rosario, Argentina. It is 1928, the year Ernesto is born.
Right.
And the source material paints this incredibly vivid, almost visceral picture of South America at the time. It describes the continent itself as breathing with difficulty.
Like it's carrying a massive invisible weight on its chest.
Yes, you have immense structural inequality, vast tracts of land owned by a tiny elite aristocracy, while the overwhelming majority carry the burden of poverty and hunger.
And you have foreign corporate influence casting these long, suffocating shadows over local economies.
So it's literally a continent gasping for air. And right in the middle of this macro-level suffocation, you have young Ernesto, who is quite literally physically gasping for air.
The defining reality of his entire childhood was a severe, chronic case of asthma. And we really need to contextualize what that meant in the 1930s.
Because it's not like today.
No, not at all. We naturally project our modern medical understanding onto the past. Today, if a child has an asthma attack, there is a protocol. You have fast-acting albuterol inhalers, nebulizers, corticosteroids.
You manage it.
Right, you manage it. But in the 1930s, especially in the early years of his life, an attack was a profound, life-threatening crisis. They had very few reliable interventions.
The sources describe these attacks arriving without any warning whatsoever.
Yeah, his chest would tighten as if it were being compressed by an invisible vice. His airways would inflame and constrict.
The details are horrifying. His lips would turn a pale blue from hypoxia, and his breathing would become this sharp, desperate wheeze.
And there's a detail in the text about the treatments available back then that really shocked me. They weren't just ineffective, they sounded torturous.
Oh yeah, like burning the powders.
Yes. They would sometimes burn special powders and make him inhale the smoke, which honestly sounds like the absolute worst thing you could do to inflamed lungs.
I mean, inhaling smoke during an asthma attack? That's just wild.
Or they would administer these crude adrenaline injections. The medical interventions were often as traumatic as the disease itself.
Right, and his parents would literally have to carry him near open windows or rush him into the damp night air.
Sometimes taking him on frantic car rides just to get airflow into his face, desperately trying to shock his respiratory system into relaxing.
And it was hours of agonizing waiting. I was trying to map this onto a psychological framework, and the best metaphor I could come up with is this. His asthma wasn't just an illness.
What was it then?
It functioned as a highly restrictive sensory filter. Think about what happens when someone loses their sight. Their hearing often becomes hyperacute to compensate.
Oh, right. Their brain remaps how they interact with the world.
Exactly. Ernesto's asthma forced a physical stillness on him. It acted as this involuntary pause button on his childhood.
That's a great way to put it.
While the other kids are running freely through the fields, exerting their energy outward, Ernesto is forced to sit completely still. He is trapped on the sidelines, fighting a war inside his own chest.
But because he can't move, his mind compensates. He simply observes.
Yes.
That is a crucial psychological mechanism. When you are immobilized, your analytical capacity often sharpens. But let's dig deeper into the emotional toll of that pause button.
Because it's not just an inconvenience.
No, it was an early, intimate, and repeated education in suffering. When a child experiences chronic bodily betrayal at such a young age, it fundamentally alters their worldview.
It violently strips away the natural illusion of invulnerability that most healthy children possess.
Exactly. He learned very early and very intimately what it feels like to be utterly helpless. His body was a cage that he could not escape.
Okay, I need to jump in and play the skeptic here because I'm struggling to draw a straight line from sick child to militant revolutionary.
That's fair.
I mean, millions of children suffer from chronic illnesses. Millions of kids know exactly what it's like to be confined to a bed, to feel that bodily betrayal.
Right, to experience that terror of helplessness.
Yeah, they don't all grow up to lead guerrilla warfare in foreign jungles. There has to be a specific catalyst.
Oh, absolutely.
Because suffering alone doesn't automatically equal profound empathy, let alone radical action. Sometimes suffering just makes people bitter or fearful or, highly self-centered.
That is the exact right question to ask, and the source material addresses this explicitly. You are absolutely correct. A fragile body often leads to a timid spirit.
Right.
When the world hurts you, the natural evolutionary response is to retreat. You become cautious. You bubble wrap yourself to avoid further pain.
Which makes total sense.
But what the sources suggest is that Ernesto's particular experience of helplessness didn't turn inward into self-pity. It projected outward as a hyper-awareness of vulnerability in others.
Because he intimately knew what it felt like to suffer through no fault of his own.
Exactly. To be punished by a biological system he didn't choose. So he developed an intense baseline empathy for people punished by social systems they didn't choose.
Wow, that's a powerful connection.
But to answer your question about the catalyst, you are right, the illness alone wasn't enough. The catalyst that turned that raw empathy into action was the specific environment he woke up in every time an asthma attack passed.
The people physically holding him during those midnight crises.
We have to look at his parents.
Right. Because the environment his parents cultivated was basically the antithesis of his physical reality. Let's step inside the Guevara household, because the sources paint a picture of a family dynamic that is wildly fascinating and completely unconventional for 1930s Argentina.
Oh, it really was.
This is not a stiff, traditional, deeply conservative Catholic home, which was the norm for their social class.
Not at all. His mother, Celia de la Serna, is an incredibly compelling figure in her own right.
She really is.
She came from a prominent, wealthy, aristocratic Argentine background. She inherited land, she had status, but she entirely rejected the social pretensions and the conservative expectations that came with that pedigree.
Instead of raising her children to care about high society, debutante balls, or maintaining their elite status, She essentially turned their home into a bohemian enclave.
Yeah, she filled the house with books, creating this massive eclectic library. And we aren't just talking about light reading.
No, definitely not.
She was giving her children Shakespeare, the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin, the poetry of Pablo Neruda, dense philosophy, sociology, and radical political theory.
She basically treated her house like a university seminar room, and she treated her children like they were fully formed, independent minds capable of grappling with those complex ideas.
Right, she wasn't handing them sanitized fairy tales. She was exposing them to the raw mechanics of the world.
And his father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, was equally unconventional, though in a totally different way.
Yeah, he was warm, highly open-minded, incredibly restless.
Yeah.
And he placed a massive premium on physical courage and adventurousness.
He had this history of failed business ventures, right? Building yachts, growing mate, always chasing the next big, daring idea.
Exactly. And there is a deeply revealing detail in the text where his father, despite watching his son practically choke to death on a regular basis, would jokingly declare to their friends and neighbors, "My son is made of iron."
Okay, this is where my brain completely short circuits.
How so?
Well, if I put myself in the shoes of a parent in the 1930s, you have a child with life-threatening asthma. There are no modern rescue inhalers. Every attack could literally be fatal.
Right.
Wouldn't your immediate, overwhelming instinct be to bubble wrap that child? To keep them inside, away from dust, away from cold air, away from any physical exertion whatsoever.
You would think so. You'd want to control every variable of their environment.
Exactly. But the sources say his parents did the exact opposite. They let him play aggressive sports. He played rugby.
Yeah, he did.
How does a parent justify letting an asthmatic child play a violent, cardiovascularly demanding sport in the dirt and mud?
It seems like borderline negligence by modern standards, doesn't
I
it?
mean, a little bit, yeah.
But this forces us to examine their core philosophy as parents, which is deeply rooted in this tension between will and determinism.
Interesting.
They fundamentally believe that a child should be guided toward individuality and resilience, not conditioned into obedience and fear.
So if they had bubble wrapped Ernesto,
If they had confined him to his bedroom and told him to rest, they would have been teaching him a very specific lesson, that his illness dictated his destiny.
I see.
They would have taught him that his biological limitations defined his boundaries in life.
They refused to let his biology be his biography.
Precisely. By refusing to treat him as fragile, they actively, almost aggressively, counteracted his physical limitations.
So think about the dual education he was receiving.
Right. His mother's intellect taught him to rigorously defend his ideas, to challenge social assumptions, and to never accept the status quo simply because it was tradition.
And his father's adventurous, restless spirit taught him physical courage.
Together, they imparted this massive foundational lesson. Life is not going to give you ease. Your body's not going to give you a break. But you always have a choice.
You can surrender to the limitations imposed upon you, or you can exercise your will and push through them.
And he didn't just passively accept that lesson. He weaponized it.
Yeah, the detail about him playing rugby is incredible. We are talking about a brutal, exhausting sport.
Very physical.
The sources describe him playing in the scrum, getting covered in dust and mud, which are massive asthma triggers.
Oh, huge triggers.
He would run until his lungs literally seized up, wheezing violently, forcing him to run over to the sidelines just to take a hit from his primitive inhaler.
His coaches and teammates were terrified.
I would be too.
They would constantly tell him he was being foolish, that it was too dangerous, that he needed to get off the field before he killed himself.
And his response, this is a quote that the source highlights. He would look at them and say, "If I must fight for my breath, I might as well fight for it doing something I love."
That is a staggering statement from a youth.
Yeah.
It perfectly encapsulates the collision of his illness and his upbringing.
He recognized the inevitability of his suffering. He knew he was going to struggle to breathe no matter what he did.
Right, so he made a conscious, defiant decision to dictate the terms of that suffering. He wouldn't suffer passively in a bed. He would suffer actively on a rugby pitch.
And this dynamic created a profound, life-altering internal tension.
He was living in a body that constantly, violently forced him to stop.
Yeah.
Yet he was growing up in a home that constantly, relentlessly pushed him to act, to question, and to push forward.
So we have this massive internal tension. Where does that tension lead his mind? Because it's one thing to stubbornly play a rough sport despite having bad lungs. It's another thing entirely to start viewing the entire structure of human society differently.
Absolutely. And the sources describe a fascinating psychological mechanism regarding how he processed his asthma attacks. They talk about this concept of the thick fog.
The thick fog.
Yeah, during these severe, suffocating episodes, his reality would distort. His vision blurred, sounds dulled, the peripheral world vanished, and his entire conscious existence narrowed down to a single primal objective, taking one more breath.
Nothing else mattered.
Exactly. But then eventually the fog would lift.
And what the psychological profile in the source material focuses on is the clarity of that post-drome state.
Yes. When that fog lifts, what happens to the mind? The absolute stillness required to survive an asthma attack forced his mind to turn deeply inward.
But the extensive library his mother provided, the Darwin, the sociology, the poetry, pushed his mind outward, giving him the intellectual tools to contextualize the world.
So when his breathing finally stabilized and he stepped out of his house in Rosario or Altagracia, he wasn't just a relieved child going back to play.
He was a highly observant, intellectually armed adolescent, stepping back into a highly stratified society.
Right. He began mapping the social dynamics with the same hyper-awareness he used to monitor his own lungs.
He started noticing the stark, unignorable contrasts of 1930s and 40s Argentina.
Which were immense.
The sources highlight how he would observe the sprawling, luxurious mansions sitting up on the breezy hills, contrasting violently with the tiny, impoverished, crowded homes down by the riverbanks.
And he noticed the agricultural workers. He didn't just see people walking, he noticed how they dragged their feet in sheer exhaustion when they returned from the fields.
Their bodies broken down by labor they couldn't escape.
He wasn't just seeing poverty as a passive background detail. He was actively analyzing the mechanics of it.
Because he was processing these external observations through the highly specific filter of his own internal biology.
Remember, this is a boy who spent every night fighting an involuntary biological system just to survive.
Right. Because his physical state was in constant flux, oscillating between suffocation and relief, he never developed the assumption that life must stay the way it is.
When you are healthy all the time, the world feels static and permanent. When your body breaks down and recovers repeatedly, you understand on a visceral level that reality is malleable.
He understood that effort could change outcomes. If he fought the panic, a breath could return. If he exerted his will, a failing body could play rugby.
Therefore, he began projecting this internal logic onto the external world. If human willpower could override an autonomic nervous system, then surely human willpower could override a broken, unequal economic system.
This is where the synthesis happens. This is the exact moment his asthma stops being just a medical condition and becomes his primary teacher.
Exactly.
As we talked about earlier, most people retreat from pain, but he interrogated it. The source uses this incredible poetic phrasing. It says he felt the poverty of others like a bruise on his own skin.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it.
I want to linger on that because that is the mechanism of his empathy. He could look at a struggling, exploited agricultural worker and feel a genuine, piercing empathy because he already intimately knew the architecture of helplessness.
His own lungs had taught him exactly what it means to be trapped by circumstances you absolutely did not choose.
He looked at poverty and recognized it not as a moral failing of the poor, but as a systemic suffocation.
Systemic suffocation. That is a brilliant way to frame it. His parents' library provided him with the vocabulary to name the injustices. Capitalism, imperialism, class stratification.
But it was the asthma that gave him the emotional capacity to actually feel them.
Right, he recognized the panic in the eyes of the disenfranchised because he saw it in the mirror every night.
However, there is a hard limit to how much empathy you can cultivate sitting in a comfortable armchair reading Pablo Neruda.
Oh, definitely. Reading gives you the vocabulary of suffering, but it doesn't show you the faces. It doesn't let you smell the desperation.
Exactly. Theory is safe. You can't truly understand the weight of the world just by looking out the window of your family's aristocratic library, no matter how many radical books your mother gives you.
So, to test whether this intellectual empathy actually held up in the real world, he had to take his fragile lungs out of that controlled environment.
He had to stress test his philosophy against the actual continent, which leads us to the pivotal phase of his early life, leaving the library for the open road.
We are now looking at his famous 1952 motorcycle journey. Ernesto is in his early 20s. He's actually a medical student at this point, studying anatomy, learning the clinical methods to soothe the suffering of patients.
But that relentless, restless curiosity instilled by his father has grown urgent.
He wants to understand the macro forces shaping human lives beyond just cellular biology.
Uh,
So he and his friend, Alberto Granado, set off across South America on a heavily battered, constantly breaking down Norton 500 motorcycle.
The one they highly optimistically named the Mighty One.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, assuming you, the listener, are somewhat familiar with the broad strokes of the Motorcycle Diaries, we aren't going to just recount their itinerary.
Right, we're looking at the underlying themes.
What we want to focus on is how the source material frames this journey. It wasn't just a youthful joyride or a gap year adventure. It was the physical manifestation of his childhood empathy.
It was his internal architecture meeting the external world.
There are two specific, highly transformative encounters detailed in the text that perfectly mirror everything we've just discussed. Let's start with what happened in Chile at the Chuquicamata copper mine.
So the Chuquicamata mine was this immense, open-pit copper mine run by foreign interests. When Ernesto and Alberto arrived, they didn't just observe the machinery. They spent time with the men laboring in those vast, dusty fields.
These miners were descending into the earth for pitiful, barely survival wages.
They were working endless, grueling hours in highly dangerous conditions with absolutely no guarantee they would come back up alive at the end of their shift.
And when Ernesto sat with them and spoke to them in the freezing desert night, sharing a blanket and some mate, he didn't just see tired workers.
No, he saw a systemic, engineered exhaustion. He saw a system where the mining companies controlled their housing, their meager wages, their healthcare, their entire existence.
And there is a quote from one of the miners that the source highlights, something that haunted Ernesto profoundly. One of the men looked at him and said, "We are buried before we die."
We're buried before we die. You have to imagine how those specific words would impact a young man who has spent his entire life fighting the literal sensation of being smothered.
It hits him at his absolute core. A boy who knows the exact terror of suffocation is now sitting across from men who are telling him they're being buried alive by an economic system.
He wrote in his diaries afterward that the suffering of those miners was the silent, invisible foundation upon which the immense wealth of others was built.
He is making the connection between the sweat of the miner and the luxury of the mansion.
Exactly. But as deeply as the miners affected him, they continue their journey further north into Peru, and they encounter an environment that pierces him even deeper.
They arrive at the San Pablo leper colony.
Right. The San Pablo leper colony in the Peruvian Amazon is arguably the critical crucible of his psychological development. In the 1950s, Hansen's disease, or leprosy, carried an immense, almost medieval social stigma.
These patients were forcibly tucked away from society, essentially exiled to the jungle.
They were treated not just as patients, but as outcasts who were fundamentally shameful to look at. The medical authorities at the time enforced strict, sanitized boundaries.
But Ernesto and Alberto show up, and they approach this environment in a way that completely violates the medical norms of the era. The very first thing they do, they refuse to wear gloves.
Which is huge.
I want to pause on that because it's so significant. You have two medical students walking into a leper colony, and they explicitly refuse to wear the protective gloves that every other doctor and nun wears.
They walk right up to the patients, they shake their hands, they embrace them, they sit with them and play football, they drop all the clinical barriers and just treat them as human beings.
And then there's this incredible cinematic moment where Ernesto celebrates his 24th birthday at the colony.
Oh, the river crossing.
Yeah. The camp is physically divided by a river. The doctors and staff live on one side, and the lepers live on the other. On the night of his birthday, Ernesto leaves the staff party, dives into the Amazon River, and physically swims across to the patient's side to celebrate with them.
It is a profoundly symbolic act, but if we connect it to the mechanics of his childhood, it is much more than symbolism. Taking off the gloves and swimming across that river was the ultimate manifestation of his empathy.
How so?
Well, as a medical student, he was realizing that the biological illness itself, the leprosy, wasn't the greatest tragedy these people were enduring.
The disease was horrible, yes, but the ultimate tragedy was the abandonment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was the total refusal of society to see them, to touch them, to care for them. The structural isolation was causing more psychological agony than the bacteria.
By shaking their hands without gloves, he was dismantling that isolation.
He was offering them dignity, and he recognized that dignity was a form of healing that traditional medicine simply couldn't provide.
If I'm putting myself in his shoes at that exact moment, you're a young doctor. You've spent years studying anatomy, pathology, pharmacology. Your entire goal has been to learn how to fix the human body.
Right.
But he is looking around at the miners in Chile and the lepers in Peru, and he realizes that his medical bag is completely useless against the actual diseases of the continent.
A stethoscope can't diagnose imperialism.
Exactly. You can't write a prescription to cure a deeply exploitative wage system that is burying men alive. He is perfectly capable of treating the biological symptoms of poverty, but he has absolutely no tools to cure the structural injustice that creates the poverty.
And that's the rub.
Did the source material indicate if this was the exact moment he gave up on traditional medicine?
It frames it as the critical turning point. This is the pivot. The sources indicate that this realization, that medicine is inadequate for systemic disease, marks the moment the empathetic, asthmatic boy from Argentina begins his slow, irreversible psychological transformation into a hardened revolutionary.
Wow.
He begins to believe that treating the symptoms of poverty while leaving the structures intact is a fool's errand. If the structure is crushing the people, the only true medical intervention is to dismantle the structure.
The ultimate preventative medicine is revolution.
Exactly. He decides that healing a single person is a noble medical act, but healing a society requires a completely different, much more violent set of tools.
So let's look at how that theoretical transformation solidifies into actual historical reality. We need to look at how the boy made of iron, as his father claimed, applied this massive childhood stubbornness and his profound empathy to the brutal, chaotic reality of actual guerrilla warfare.
Right. Let's fast forward and look at his time in the Sierra Maestra Mountains in Cuba.
Assuming a baseline understanding of the Cuban Revolution, Ernesto joins Fidel Castro's movement. They sail to Cuba on the Granma, and they end up retreating into the Sierra Maestra Mountains to launch a guerrilla war against the Batista dictatorship.
But I want to focus purely on the physical reality of that environment for Ernesto. The Sierra Maestra is an unforgiving, hostile terrain.
Just brutal.
We are talking about dense, suffocatingly humid jungles, thin mountain air, constant torrential rain, a severe chronic lack of proper food or shelter, and intense physical exertion while constantly being hunted by the military.
For a man with severe chronic asthma, it was a biological nightmare. It was the absolute worst place on earth he could possibly be.
It's essentially every childhood asthma trigger amplified by 1,000.
Precisely. And the conditions triggered relentless, violent asthma attacks, worse than anything he experienced in Rosario.
The text has this vivid description of him during these marches. He would be literally gasping for breath, desperately pressing his inhaler to his lips, forced to stop on the side of a mountain trail while the rest of the column moved past him.
The physical terror of suffocation was right there, just like when he was a kid.
But the key detail is what he did the moment the attack passed. The second his airways opened up, he would stand up, adjust his gear, and march forward as if absolutely nothing had happened.
He categorically refused to let the men under his command see his fear or his physical weakness.
He refused any special treatment. He carried his own incredibly heavy pack full of medical supplies and ammunition. And on top of fighting, he worked tirelessly as the camp medic.
Pulling teeth, stitching up wounds by candlelight, treating his men while his own lungs were failing.
What we are seeing in the Sierra Maestra is the exact psychological conditioning of his childhood playing out on a geopolitical stage.
He was applying the exact same force of will he used to survive the nights in Argentina.
He refused to let his failing body dictate his limits. But it wasn't just about physical endurance. His leadership style was the direct manifestation of the moral code his parents instilled in him.
They taught him individuality and the absolute necessity of leading by example.
In the mountains, he wasn't theatrical. Unlike Fidel Castro, who was highly charismatic, known for his booming, hours-long speeches and grandstanding, Guevara was quiet, intensely analytical, and highly severe.
It's the rugby story all over again. When he was a kid, he refused to sit on the sidelines when his coaches told him to stop.
Right.
In the mountains, when his body was literally failing him, his sheer willpower was dragging him up the terrain. He had this absolute ironclad rule for himself. He refused to demand of his soldiers anything that he wouldn't endure himself.
If his men were starving, he was serving. If they were marching through the mud, he was marching through the mud even if he couldn't breathe.
He had fully morphed. The curious boy reading poetry in the library had hardened into the steel that kept the rebellion from collapsing under its own weight during those early, desperate months.
Yet, and this is crucial to the source materials analysis, despite this incredibly severe, highly disciplined, hardened exterior that guerrilla warfare demands, he never lost that tender childhood empathy for the marginalized.
While they were in the mountains, he lived among the rural campesinos. The desperately poor agricultural workers who shared their meager rations of rice and beans with the rebels.
He didn't just recruit them, he set up schools to teach them how to read. He treated their illnesses. He listened to their stories.
His intense militant revolutionary discipline was entirely fueled by that original baseline empathy born from his own physical suffering.
He was fighting the system that kept them poor with the same ferocity he fought his own asthma.
So we see this incredible, tragic full circle. The asthma never left him. It wasn't something he conquered in his youth and left behind.
No, it stalked him his entire life. The sources describe his final days. Years later, after Cuba, he goes to Bolivia to try and spark another revolution.
And the movement fails.
He does. He is hunted down in the ravines of the Bolivian jungle. During his final fatal ambush, when his guerrilla column is collapsing, he is surrounded by the military, he is wounded in the leg, his weapon is destroyed, he is still coughing violently.
The text notes that he was still clutching that same asthma inhaler while trying to return fire.
The physical limitation that defined his very first breath was there, demanding his attention, until his very last moment.
It was his constant companion. The illness that first forced him to sit still and observe the world was right there in his pocket as he violently left it.
It really makes you think.
It does.
Yes.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's step back and look at the architecture we've uncovered. We started with a fragile, terrified boy suffocating in the night, and we ended with a hardened global symbol of defiance.
But what the source material clearly shows us is that the real story isn't the two-dimensional myth printed on the t-shirt. The actual human truth is infinitely more complex.
His intense, world-altering empathy for the suffering of others was directly, mechanically born from his own intimate relationship with physical pain.
And his fierce intellectual fire, his belief that the world could actually be changed, was ignited by parents who flat out refused to let his biology be his biography. They refused to let him be defined by his limitations.
It forces us to look at the architecture of our own lives differently.
Oh, absolutely. If we trace all these threads back to their origin, it leaves us with a fascinating and perhaps deeply unsettling thought to consider.
What's that?
Well, we spend so much of our modern lives trying to hide, manage, or cure our greatest limitations. We look at our physical weaknesses, the socioeconomic hurdles of our environment, or the deep traumas of our childhoods, and we view them strictly as obstacles.
Right, they are bugs in the system. We want to medicate them, fix them, or ignore them so we can just get on with the business of being successful.
But looking at the psychological blueprint of Ernesto's early life, it raises a profound question. What if the very things that restrict us, the traumas that force us to pause, the weaknesses that make us struggle just to draw a breath, are not obstacles at all?
What if the specific limitations are actually the exact foundational blueprints for our deepest empathy?
Exactly. What if the struggle you are trying to cure is actually the catalyst for your ultimate life's purpose?
What if the very cage that traps you is actually the key to understanding the world? That is something incredibly powerful to mull over as you go about your week.
It really is.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden forces that shape a life. We'll catch you on the next one.